But if God got us, then we gon' be alright. Hey, we gon' be alright. Yeah, we gon' be alright. We gon' be alright. Do you hear me?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Musings of a Biracial Theologian. Now, today's episode is super exciting because this is my first ever episode of Woke Wednesday. So on Woke Wednesday, I just will be sharing with you all a book, a movie, a podcast, a song I've been enjoying that I think talks about cool social justice issues or different issues in society and gives a cool perspective, tells a cool story, or just generally informs our minds, our hearts, our souls, and introduces a new way of thinking theologically, a new way of interacting with people, new ways to do conversation, things like that. So with all this being said, let's get started. I also just think it's really important for me to name my lens and name my bias as I'm making these videos. So I am a biracial woman. I am half black, half white, and that is a huge part of my identity. So how that impacts me with these videos with my channel is with my Woke Wednesdays, with the books I recommend, with the music I'll sometimes be recommending, with the people and the figures that I'll be recommending, is a lot of the time they will be Black Americans, they will be African Americans, people in the Black community, because that is my lens. And I desire to showcase people that are similar to myself. And yeah, so just be prepared that on this channel, the majority of what I will be representing will be from my perspective as a biracial woman. So I will be showcasing a lot of Black music, Black art, Black figures, and things like that, which I think are super important and super amazing. So just realize that. So today's song of the week, rightfully so, is Erykah Badu's Master Teacher Medley. Now this song came out in 2008, and it is still one of my favorite songs today. So Erykah Badu's song Master Teacher Medley is the source and the birthplace of the phrase and of the term stay woke. So naturally it is fitting for me to talk about the song Master Teacher Medley and all of its meaning because it's Woke Wednesday. The song, I interpret it as Erykah Badu dreaming about a world in which racial prejudice, racial violence, discrimination, and all the negativity and the pain that people of color experience in America would not exist. The chorus states, what if there were no N-words, only master teachers? And she repeatedly says, I stay woke. So, she's basically saying that although she has dreams of masters, teachers, of white supremacy, of supremacy over others, and racial division in America, she stays awake and she stays aware of the reality of tension, the reality of race relations, the reality of social violence that people of color and different people groups experience in America. So this is the real birthplace of the term woke, and it has endured and new meanings have come about over time, but I interpret it to mean, and I believe that the term woke means staying aware of social tension, of social problems, of the issues, hardships, violence, and different things that people of color and minorities may face in America. So that song very deeply influenced me. It influences this channel where we will talk about the social justice and the social realities in our world and endeavor to stay woke through it all. So today's book of the week is called The Death of Race, and it is by Brian Bantum. Brian Bantum is a professor of theology at Seattle Pacific University and also just a really sought after person for conversations about Christianity and race relations. So The Death of Race is a book and a theology that deeply shaped and impacted me. It revolutionized my faith and my idea and conception of God because it introduced to me for the first time that God cares about our bodies. God cares about the systems of race, of gender, that work within society that cause destruction and death to our lives. This book had a very big influence on me, specifically in my last video in my response to Charlottesville. My response, the different things that I was saying, and the advice I had, and my stories were very much influenced by Brian Bantum, were very much influenced by his book, The Death of Race. So Brian Bantum is a biracial man. So he is half black, half white, but also he's married to a Korean American woman, and they have 3 wonderful mixed race children together. So in this book, Brian talks about his life growing up and having to reconcile with his own racial identity, living in that in-between kind of gray area, complex space, living between two very different racial worlds. Bantum tells a lot of stories about his family, about what it was like for him growing up as a biracial man, what it's like to be married to a Korean woman, what it is like to have 3 mixed race children, and how he has seen the reality of race in Asian American culture and biracial in between kind of the world that he lives in, and how he sees race affect those very intimate parts of his life. So in this book, Brian Bantum talks about race as a construct, as a system, an idea, a story in society that brings death, destruction, dehumanization to different bodies, specifically darker bodies. He discusses how, as Christians and as humans, we were created not to be sovereign, not to be individuals, but to live in a relationship, to live in mutuality with one another. He talks about the personhood of Christ as someone who is a subversive figure who continually reaches out to those marginalized in society, who overcomes racial and societal gender boundaries in Christ's own life on earth, and also describes that if we are to be followers of Christ, it means that we are to pursue relationships with those that are different than us and pursue mutuality, pursue relationship, despite the differences that divide us in society. Here's one of my favorite quotes from the book. So, he writes, "Christ's freedom reduces death by saying that our freedom is bound to the life and thriving of our neighbor. To be the presence of Christ is to refuse the stories of death in our society and become communities of Christ, images of life, of bodies imbued with God and made to be for one another. If I am to be free, I must speak and live and work for the freedom of Christ and others." So in this book, The Death of Race, Brian Bantum is not talking about or pushing the need to live in a post-racial society, to live in a colorblind society. He is instead bringing to readers' attention the pain and the hardship and the destruction that the system of race causes in our world and in our society. And then afterwards, he's bringing attention to the life of Christ. Brian Bantum just really talks about the importance of Christ being incarnated, of God's presence being manifest in the life of Christ, and how important and revolutionary it is that Christ reached out to all of those that society cast aside. So if you're looking for a book that's going to teach you how to be a better follower of Christ in regards to race relations, if you want to know and be introduced to a new theology of bodies, a new theology of how race affects our bodies, or just be called and pushed to love as Christ, to live as Christ, and to reach out to people as Christ did, I really do recommend this book. It's about 170 pages, and it's an amazing read with tons of scripture and biblical support, tons of well-known stories through a really cool lens of what it teaches us about Christ as a subversive figure, Christ as a loving figure, Christ as someone who reached out to the marginalized continually. I have 2 podcast recommendations today. The first is New Abbey Church podcast, and the second is Code Switch by NPR. So in future videos, I will probably recommend specific videos, but for today, I just thought I would recommend 2 different podcast channels and introduce them in kind of the platform, the voice, and the things that they will talk about, so that in future videos, I will be able to recommend specific episodes. New Abbey podcast is derivative of New Abbey Church that's in Pasadena. One of the things that New Abbey Church like to say is they like to engage in conversations and ask the questions that typically aren't supposed to be asked in church. So this past 7 weeks, they did a question series where they allowed people in the church community to send in any questions that they had. They have made all of those conversations and talks into podcasts. So those podcasts vary from sexuality and freedom to how do we know God, to why do we refer to God as she sometimes, can we refer to God as she? And they also recently did a podcast discussing Charlottesville and the church's role in Charlottesville and power systems. So follow New Abbey Church, listen to their podcasts for important conversations and questions that you've always wanted to have but maybe not had the chance to. My personal favorite New Abbey Church podcasts are On Sexuality and Freedom, Charlottesville, and How Do We Know God? Second podcast that I'm going to recommend to you all is called Code Switch by NPR. So Code Switch by NPR is a podcast that is run by journalists of color who talk about different issues of race and identity. The journalists and the hosts of the show are funny. Some of the episodes are hilarious, some make you uncomfortable, some are just very informative, some evoke empathy, but either way, it's just so honest, so helpful, and just really foster a way of talking about race, talking about identity from all racial identities in America, from Latino, Asian American, Black America, and all that I'm not mentioning. So I really recommend listening to Code Switch for all of your questions, thoughts, conversations about race and identity in America. My most recent favorite episodes that I can recommend are the episode on racism within and outside of the Latino community, and their episode, I Am Not a Racist, I'm an Argentine. The documentary highlights the fact that 1 in 3 Black men will experience prison time in their lifetime, whereas 1 in 17 white men will experience prison time in their lifetime, and how this really shows that how to talk about race within your family. Their episode on what to do in the aftermath of Philando Castile's death was very helpful and informative to me when I was really struggling after his killer was not convicted, was charged not guilty. So definitely subscribe to and listen to Code Switch ASAP. Very, very highly recommend the Netflix documentary called 13th. So I apologize if I'm saying her name incorrectly, but Ava DuVernay, a documentarian powerhouse, an amazing woman, made this documentary 13th back in 2016, and it won so many awards. It was nominated by the Academy and won 8 nonfiction awards and an Emmy and so many others. The documentary tells the story of modern slavery in America. The 13th Amendment in the Constitution roughly states that involuntary servitude and slavery is abolished within the United States unless one is convicted of a crime. Then slavery is legalized. So in the movie, it really introduces us and helps us to realize that slavery is not over. Modern slavery exists in America still today, in the mass incarceration, in the prison system, and it specifically targets, criminalizes, and convicts and affects brown men and women of color in America. It introduces the idea that America and the prison system in America is responsible for 25% of the world's prisoners, even though the United States itself is only responsible for 5% of the world's population. And that is a problem. The movie just breaks down and talks about the huge growth that our prison system and the amount of people in our prison system has experienced since the 70s and since before that, and historically traces this back way back even to slavery and to the abolition of slavery. In an interview with CNN, Ava DuVernay expresses that her main goal with this movie is not for legislation or for mass change to all of a sudden occur at once. But her main goal is for people, for Americans, to just be aware, to know and understand the problem of mass incarceration, the effects of the prison system on race relations, on racial divisions, and on America as a whole. She interviews a variety of activists, of politicians, of historians, and different experts and perspectives on the topic of the prison system. She also interviews different people who have experienced incarceration and talk about their experiences and the effects that it's had in their life since. So the movie is forceful, it's thorough, it interviews so many different people and experts from all sides and all spectrums politically, all spectrums ideologically, and just really makes a very thorough, holistic conversation about the problem of mass incarceration in America.
We've been hurt, been down before. When our pride was low, looking at the world like, where do we go? And we hit popo, wanna kill us dead in the streets for sure. Yeah, I'm at the preacher's door, my knees getting weak and my gun might blow, but we gon' be alright.